Part 6 of our series is the Napoleonic Wars Part 2, this time covering 1804 to 1812. Napoleon at this point realized that England was still a problem due to their dominance at the sea, so he starts thinking about making his empire in the West, in the Americas, rather than the east of Europe. He gets the Louisiana Purchase from Spain after 80 years of Spanish control. His plan is to use it as a territory to sell his Haitian products. That's right, Haiti was the closest thing to a crown jewel in France's colonial holdings, specifically with products like tea and coffee. Haiti, however, is divided in half, with part of it under the control of France and part of it under the control of Spain. And that's where one of the most interesting historical figures that you haven't ever learned about comes in, Toussaint Louverture, which is French for opening the way. He's the leader of the slave revolution that overthrows the French and Spanish landlords. Toussaint is 50 at the time, and he's working on the plantation of his former master, as he had grown up a slave. He was inspired by the French Revolution's Enlightenment ideals and took up arms, initially siding with the Spanish, but then switching his support back to France after the government abolished slavery. He started out as a doctor/soldier, but establishes himself and gains the nickname Black Napoleon. After successfully winning the war and driving the Spanish out, he declares himself Lord Governor. Napoleon initially supports him and promises not to bring back slavery to the islands, but tells him specifically not to continue the invasion and takeover of the Spanish side. Toussaint, however, doesn't listen, and he invades. The French send forces to put him down, but yellow fever and the Haitian rebels destroy them. They parley with him and betray him. Toussaint unfortunately dies in a frozen prison in France within a year. Louverture is French for opening the way, which is fitting as Toussaint is a figure in over 100 Latin American revolutions who all looked to him for inspiration as they fought for their freedom from oppression. Seeing how difficult it is to conquer one Haitian island, Napoleon gives up on the dream of a Western empire, and he realizes he needs money to build ships to fight England at the sea. So he takes his colonial land holdings in the West and sells the Louisiana Purchase to U.S. President Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson wasn't even sure that the U.S. had the constitutional right to buy the property. However, it was so cheap and so expansive that he decided to do it anyways. This sets a collision course between France and England that will make up the next decade. England decides to strike first and begins the wars. English commandos destroyed most of the ships that Napoleon had planned to use to guard the transports that he had built before he went off on his Egyptian adventure. Why was England so upset? Well, it gets to a concept called counterbalancing. Napoleon's growing military power scared non-allies into working together. They wanted to counterbalance the power of France. That meant that the Allies were made up of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. They were united by British money. In fact, Prussia literally only did it for the British money, as they weren't too worried about Napoleon's power. Russia is paid 1.25 million pounds a year for every 100,000 troops that they put in the field against Napoleon. The die is cast. The operation has begun. Napoleon said, on the 17th I will be in Germany with 200,000 men. And thus the war began. Austria assumes that Napoleon will return through Italy, as he did before, but this time he surprises them and goes through Germany instead. Like Italy, last time Napoleon invaded, Germany wasn't a full country yet. But partly because of what Napoleon does, they will become one. He wins his most decisive battle ever at Austerlitz in Austria, and Austria surrenders. The French had campaigned for 8 straight weeks and had blitzed Austria. Upon hearing the news of the victory, the British general remarked, "Roll up that map of Europe, it will not be needed for these 10 years." Napoleon's position was already so strong that the war looked over before it ever began. The conquering of Germany officially ends the Holy Roman Empire. But Napoleon wasn't done. After knocking out Austria and taking over Vienna, it was now Prussia's time in the barrel. He blitzes Prussia and wins at Jena, knocking them out of the war, once again before Russia can even get there. Thus, in 33 days, Napoleon had inflicted 55,000 casualties, taken 40,000 troops captive, and gained 2,000 cannons for use by his army. But he doesn't stop at Jena. He then blitzes Russia, starting in June of 1807. At this point, however, the people of France were no longer celebrating his victory. They were beginning to turn on their emperor. They began asking with each victory, why can't he stop? When is it going to be enough? Napoleon successfully fights Russia to a standstill throughout winter all the way till February, when he returns to Prussia and raises his army up to 600,000 by drafting people from Prussia, Germany, and Austria. With this army behind him, he offers peace to Russia. He does this partly because his army was too big for him. It was too big to maintain the Napoleonic principles of living off the land and staying mobile within one day of each other. But it was an overpowering army, and Russia was now alone, although much richer because of England's money. Tsar Alexander I meets Napoleon on a barge that Napoleon built for the occasion. He literally put a cabin on it with a door and then arrived first so that he could be the one that opened up the door for the Tsar. Alexander starts out the conversation with a quote, "Sire, I hate the English as much as you." "In that case," replied Napoleon, "peace is established." They get along awesomely, and to seal the peace they discuss Napoleon marrying one of his sisters. This despite the fact that Napoleon is still married to the well-known cheater Josephine. He eventually says, quote, "I am satisfied with Alexander, and he should be satisfied with me. If he were a woman, I think I would make him my mistress." With peace settled, he returns to France victorious, with control of Austria, Germany, Prussia, and peace with Russia. He forces all of these nations to turn their attention towards England, specifically with an economic blockade. Without the transports to be able to invade England, there's nothing he can do about them, even though he did examine the possibility of attacking with hot air balloons, or possibly even digging a tunnel underneath the English Channel to invade from land. This economic blockade accelerated the Industrial Revolution in Europe. See, England had perfected mercantilism, which had replaced feudalism as the dominant economic system in the world. England had the most colonies. Those colonies would produce things. For instance, in America, we produce cotton. You would then send those products to England in order to make the finished product. In our case, cotton became textiles, or clothing. Those textiles would then be sold back to the colonies for a huge profit for the mother nation. This influx of raw materials resulted in them creating factories faster than all other European nations. And those factories were more efficient, which means they could lower the price. That meant that England textiles and other products were substantially cheaper than those from other European nations. Instead of making their own factories, European nations on the continent were happy to have access to cheap British goods. However, with the blockade, they were forced to industrialize themselves. Some nations better than others. For instance, Russia never weaned itself off of the English products. This widespread industrial revolution will give Europe a huge advantage as the next era of imperialism begins. But at this point in history, one thing was clear. Napoleon was the master of the most important countries in the world.